Thanks very much indeed, Dr. Manser. Our final speaker this evening is Mrs. Maureen Hetherington. Maureen.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here, and thanks to Heritage Lottery and the Community Relations Council and their support for our work throughout since 2010. I want to say something. I am not an historian, so I'm looking for an easy time at the panel at the end of the night as well. And also, I want to say a couple of things. I'm a grassroots worker, but there's three things I suppose we're trying to achieve in our project. And number one, it's closing the gap between the academic and the grassroots work, looking at what the historians are saying and how we apply that at the grassroots level. And support the development of training materials that help us address that knowledge gap or knowledge deficit that is so prevalent throughout our time in the work that we've been doing with young people and adults, and the ignorance around people's own history or what they've grown up with and their own version of history. And also probably make a contribution to being a history maker rather than a history commemorator. And that's been important for us in our journey in the project work, that we can reenact the historical events, we can reenact and not move on, or we can be history makers. And it goes back to Judaism, biblical times, where in the Bible it would talk about we are history makers. History is not cyclical, but rather it's linear, and we create our history. And so that's about, not reenacting the past either. I head up a project called The Junction. It's a community relations resource and peace building initiative. And we've been running a project for 14 years now called Towards Understanding and Healing. And Towards Understanding and Healing is about dealing with the past through storytelling and positive encounter dialogue. And that's looking at the individual story, the individual narrative. And I suppose the tension between historians and public history, sometimes that creates the tension, but our contribution to the public history is by gathering that narrative, gathering the individual truths or stories of what has happened to people in the more recent past. So in September 2010, we launched a project called Ethical and Shared Remembering, and that was commemoration in a new context, remembering a decade of change and violence, 1912 to 1922. And it was in looking at the societal story or the community story. So often we look at the individual narrative, and how do we then move to the societal story, the story we tell ourselves, which has also kept us apart, kept us separate and ignorant of the other. So this project, we see that as a unique opportunity to address the recent more raw conflict in a way that doesn't diminish the other, but rather allows us to use the distant past as a prism to unpack our more recent past. So the title in itself is challenging, and we have been challenged with that by groups that we've been working with. So remembering ethically means exploring the many personalities of that decade and all their complexity, their contradictions, their insights and their blind spots. And it also means exploring those personalities who have been forgotten and whose memories have been repressed because they were part of an alternative story and alternative politics. I think that John talked about, the alternative covenant signing, where 3,000 unionists wanted to live equally and alongside their fellow Irishmen. And that's a language, more recently it was even quite difficult to find the alternative covenant. It was hidden away somewhere. And it's about unpacking those things. So it is about unpacking the key personalities, the policies and actions of the time, and then reflecting ultimately on the consequences of all of those actions, whether good or bad. And we're looking at the unionist side, looking at Carson and Craig. We're examining De Valera and Collins, and then also on the British side, Lloyd George and Bonar Law. So there's different ways of unpacking that history. Who were the personalities? What were the actions and policies of the time? And ultimately the consequences. And I might be wrong in saying this, but De Valera, apparently in 1937, when he was asked what his regrets of the past or what would he have done differently, he said he would have signed the Home Rule Agreement. He wouldn't have gone against the anti-treaty, which meant the violence and killing of so many more people. And the shared remembering aspect, it may not necessarily mean turning up to each other's events, though mutual hospitality would be a tremendous gesture on all sides. But it does mean to try to enter into each other's histories and complexities together. As I say, walking through history together and trying to reach a better understanding, not only of our own story, but the other story also. And we've been working on a number of templates or frameworks within the project as a way of trying to build an ethical and shared society within the context of the 21st century. And we're not about confrontation, blame, or setting the record straight, but we are proposing some ways of opening up dialogue, learning, and sharing together. So what we're saying is we have a broad ethical template in the approach of the project, and that's about remembering the decade as a whole. You know, that these events can't be separated out. 1912 led to 1916 and so on and so forth. So you've got to look at the decade as a whole, not separate it out, not look at one commemoration and ignore another, but look at it as a whole decade. Remembering the future, always as we prepare for these commemorative events, what is the future that we want? If we're building a shared and ethical society, what is it that we have to look to? What do we have to get right now in order to build relationships rather than breaking them down? And again, I've just talked there briefly about how we remember ethically. And that's asking and raising ethical, critical questions that we need to unpack that decade as a way of looking at our more recent past. And then remembering together, how do we walk through history together? How do we look and examine and explore the past in a way that moves us into a shared future? And then another one, the big one really, and it has to be unpacked a lot more, and it has been talked by our speakers tonight, and I know it has been addressed throughout. How do we remember in context? You know, 1912 to 1922 was a separate and very, very different world than what we have here today. So through our training materials, we're going to be looking at the context of that time and then looking at the context today. So we had nationalism. Britain, one of the imperial powers, was a major player in the creation of the 19th century nationalism. And yet in Britain's first colony, the divide and rule policy, there's two intransigent nationalisms then were created, the Catholic nationalist tradition alongside the Protestant nationalism of Ulster. Then we have religion. So in that decade, life was lived in a world of domination systems, and the church was no different. It was hierarchical, patriarchal, and closely aligned with politics. And even we talk about a more secular society today, we still have deep, deep sectarianism. And what's interesting to me is that in our workshops that we do around sectarianism, we never really unpack those deep theological roots of sectarianism as well as the historical roots. And it's that lack of knowledge, or again, ignorance, that we need to revisit and start to unlearn some of the things that we've taught in order to break down the barriers and the sectarianism that exists. Again, the violence of that time. I mean, at that time, 1912, 1922, it changed Ireland politically, and the change was, and it remains evident in the partition. So it was also a decade of brutality and violence, and any remembering or commemoration that we do a century on will be just another act of denial unless the violence is critically unmasked and acknowledged. So now we're coming up the decade of 2012 to 2022, so they will provide the potential to remove the ideology or religion of violence from the future. And again, it was mentioned there about feminism. And there were injustices perpetrated against women at that time by the government of the day. And the suffrage movement of that period suffered because of nationalism and violence. And today we still have a lot of inequalities and about ethnic minorities and minority groupings, and also the whole gender equality. It still needs to be unpacked. And then we're also going to look at the literary culture of that time. There were great writers of the time actually unpacking and exploring many of the big key themes. We're going to revisit some of those, and then also look at the more recent past. You know, what of the literary culture that we have today? How is it enriching and nurturing us? So that's something that we have to look at today also. And then the struggle for social justice. And it was a world of class divisions, upstairs, downstairs. And again, today we still have huge class divisions. So the war wasn't just on the ideology, but it was also about a class divisions. So we're looking at all of those to unpack. We've also adapted the work of Richard Kearney, and that's to engage in conversations that can help to make us bigger than our own story. So we have narrative hospitality. So we need to be willing and open to other stories, many more stories than our own. We have narrative plurality. There's not one history, but versions of Irish history and stories told from different historical and experiential perspectives. Even the same account recounted differently. And then we have narrative flexibility. So there's more than one narrative, and acknowledging the many is to be open to deeper understandings and fresh interpretations. So we're using that as a template to work out that distant past, to examine the more recent past. And then our project's going to incorporate in its resource materials and training ways of introducing the complexity of our past, present and future. And we're calling this, and it's not, again, it's an adaptation, but we're using integrated complexity. And integrated complexity is referred to as IC, and it rhymes with IC, a way of seeing things, the world, history, politics, theology, whatever, and it moves through different levels. So for example, at level 1 is mono. There's just one way of seeing things, only one truth, one perspective, one way of doing. And it's about simplism, literalism. It is fundamentalist politics or religion. So as we go through the training, we move up to level 3. How do we see several points of view? But the way that we are in our own story, there's still no branching out or weaving of things together. But when you reach level 5, you have several points of view, different ways of seeing things, and you're beginning to integrate them. Some weaving together is going on. And then at the level 7, many points of views are integrated and woven together. So you not only see different points of view, but you can see them in all their complexity. So nothing's simple. There's no simple point of view. But at 7, you've integrated the complexity. You can see and hold together complex viewpoints, complex ways of seeing things. You can now see the complexity in the other's perspectives. And this is where conflict transformation and reconciliation practice becomes a one-one instead of a one-lose situation. So these are the things that we're trying to do in our project, to have people sitting together, exploring ethically that decade, looking at the more recent past and starting to unpack it. And with regards to the story around complexity, this was talked about at the launch last Friday, and it was so interesting that I'm going to mention it today. So what is maybe even of greater complexity relates to an earlier period of history outside the decade. So at the beginning of the 17th century, 2 powerful dynasties came to an end. Queen Elizabeth I died, and not having any heirs to the throne, it was the end of the Tudor dynasty. Elizabeth had violently opposed Hugh O'Neill, the great Earl of Tyrone. O'Neill suffered a humiliating defeat in 1601 and was forced to accept loss of power and land in the same year Elizabeth died. By 1607, he had taken flight from Ireland, never to return. It was the end of a great Gaelic dynasty. Now I'm going somewhere with this, so this is the last part. So O'Neill, however, had a daughter, Saoirse. Saoirse O'Neill married an Irish aristocrat, Magennis of Ivey, territory around present-day Banbridge. 10 generations later, Saoirse's direct descent became Lady Glamis. In 1900, Lady Glamis gave birth to a daughter who was baptised Elizabeth Bowes Lyons. Years later, Elizabeth had a daughter whom she also called Elizabeth. That Elizabeth was in Enniskillen today to celebrate the Diamond Jubilee of her being Queen of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So it's a small world. And tomorrow, the deputy, after much deliberation, I have to say, the Deputy First Minister will shake hands with the great 14 or so times removed granddaughter of Hugh O'Neill. So the Deputy First Minister's surname is an English plantation name with an English spelling. So the great irony, and I'll end in this, is that the Queen Elizabeth may have more Irish roots than the Deputy First Prime Minister. Nothing or no one's simple. Everything is complex, and we all struggle to integrate the complexities of history, politics, theology, or whatever. Thank you.